My name is Paul Kautza. I'm the Director of Education for TDWI, and I want to welcome you to Orlando and thank you for spending your week with us. Just a couple questions before we start. How many of you, is this your first TDWI conference? Okay, put your hands down. How many is, the rest of you, your second or third? Keep your hands up. Everybody that's your first conference, if you got somebody at a table, talk to them about their experience at prior conferences, because there's a lot more to do here than just go to your classes and learn from your instructors. You can learn a lot from each other. There's a chance that somebody in this room either has the same problem or has solved the same problem that you're trying to solve. Network with each other, learn from each other. There'll be a number of opportunities throughout the week for you to do that. But please take advantage of the talent and the knowledge that's sitting around you in this room, because there's a lot of it here. So take the opportunity to get the full experience of not just the classroom, but the networking. Just a couple of announcements. Tomorrow, breakfast is at 7:30 out here in the foyer, and classes will start sharply at 8 a.m. And for those of you who have parked in the facility, if you stop after the afternoon or at the afternoon break at the reg desk, you can get the discounted parking ticket for the parking pass. And finally, tonight, right after class, there will be a partner member receptions with refreshment and hors d'oeuvres, and I believe it's going to be in Pacifica 12, down around the corner. So it'll be right after class, and they'll be giving prizes and stuff away. So those are the announcements for this morning. It's my pleasure right now to announce this morning's keynoter, Marc Demarest. Marc is the CEO and principal of Noumenal, an international management consulting firm that works with buyers and sellers in information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and clean green technology. Active in data warehousing and business intelligence since the early 90s, Marc speaks and writes frequently on topics related to social technical aspects of commercial decision-making, and has been a contributor at TDWI events for the past 5 years. And I have to say, he's also not a very dynamic speaker, so I hope you guys give him a little energy this morning.
Morning, everybody. Anybody else having trouble getting the Hawaiian music out of your head? It's a little disconcerting. You wake up at 6 o'clock, you come outside, it's dark and it's raining, and there's a slack guitar playing everywhere you turn. So I'll try to get the Hawaiian music out of your head in the next 45 minutes. And to do that, I thought we would take a little metaphoric voyage, which I decided I would title Swimming in the Cuyahoga. Anybody here from Ohio? Excellent. So some people have practical experience with this. The Cuyahoga is a beautiful valley. It's an Iroquois word, and I believe it means crooked river. And if you look at the river on the map, indeed it is crooked. I believe its headwaters are actually farther north than its point of drainage in Lake Erie. And it's quite beautiful, particularly the upper reaches of the river. But it has a different reputation, another reputation that some of you who are roughly of my vintage will remember, and that is that in the 1950s, in the lower reaches of the Cuyahoga, pollution had become such a problem that on several occasions the river just spontaneously caught fire. Some people credit the rising up of the ecology movement in the 60s to the stark images of an American river literally on fire for days at a time. So warning, we're going to be talking about metaphors here. A burning river. Metaphors, as everybody knows, are figures of speech. They're rhetorical devices that attempt to provide insight into something by comparing it to something fundamentally different. Right? We're all taught to use them in school, and in our industry, they are rife. Every one of our central architectural concepts is actually a metaphor. Data warehouse, data mart, data hub, and the metaphor that is rising in our collective vocabulary, the data lake. Anybody heard this term? Really, only the... Wow. Come on, folks. This is the new way to talk about what we do, to talk about data management. We've moved from warehouses and marts, things that were taken from distribution and retail, flirted briefly with the notion of a data hub, which is another kind of logistical convenience, and have moved very rapidly to data lake. Now, as with all good things, there are many people who claim to have invented the concept of a data lake, and I happen to be reading the blog post of one of those people the other day who assured all of his readers that he had spent a great deal of time thinking very carefully through this metaphor before he decided to deploy it into the public domain. Now, he didn't tell us what he thought about or what alternatives he considered, but he assured us that he'd given us a great deal of thought. So I thought I would run with that concept of a data lake. And before I do that, I want to remind you about what the famous philosopher Paul Demerist said about metaphors. He said, "One wonders whether metaphors are illustrations of cognition, that is, things that help us think about something, or if cognition is shaped by metaphors." Elsewhere, he said that every metaphor we deploy, for all of the insight that it brings us, also brings us a blindness. There is something we can't see. Now, I think about data lakes, and I immediately start looking at the first part of that phrase, data. We've talked a lot about warehouses. Those were fundamentally places where one put finished goods in preparation for distribution. And when in the mid-90s we figured out that warehouses were extraordinarily difficult for decision makers to navigate, we extended the metaphor and we started talking about marts, which were much more like your corner stores, where data was deployed for particular constituencies in ways that were familiar to them. The data hub, which didn't last very long, was a yet further extension of that logistical metaphor we're deploying. But when we jumped from hub to lake, we made a big leap. We leaped from notions that were fundamentally manufacturing and logistics oriented to a metaphor that's fundamentally about a free-flowing natural resource. And that is a big leap, particularly for those of us who see our primary responsibility in the organizations we work in as being about data management. Because the way one manages a natural resource is very different than the way one manages a manufacturing process or a logistical network. Now, fires in rivers make me think about something else, about fire in the lake. Is this phrase familiar to everybody? Anybody? In 1972, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and historian Frances Fitzgerald wrote a book explaining to us why the Vietnam War had been such a disastrous failure for America. She called that book Fire in the Lake. That is the Chinese symbol for fire in the lake, which is usually translated as revolution. You can see why that makes a lot of sense. Two of the four fundamental elements of the universe, fire and water, coexisting at the same time. It's also a powerful symbol in the I Ching, which was the Chinese book of divination, where it means fire that burns away corruption and vice. A symbol for revolution, fire in the river, fire in the lake. Is there a revolution going on? Well, if you look at the terms that have defined our fundamental metaphors for the last 20 years, data warehouse, business intelligence, decision support, and we go to the one source of truth in the universe today, which is Google, and we ask Google Trends, how are these terms trending over long periods of time? The answer is, there's a secular downtrend for all of these terms. Now, I look at this graph and being of that generation that defined itself as a builder of decision support systems, I'm particularly troubled to see that decision support never rose as high in the public interest as either business intelligence or data warehousing. But I'm particularly troubled to see all of those terms trending down, and then to discover that the reason why they are doing so has something to do with that green line there. And the search term du jour, indeed of the last 4 or 5 years, big data. I mean, big data is not only more interesting to all of us, apparently, than all of these other terms combined, but it's reaching new heights in the general interest pool as described by Google Trends. Now, you might ask yourself, yeah, but what does this really mean? Where does that data come from? How does Google arrive at these conclusions? And those would be exactly the right questions. But of course, we're not able to determine that in the Google universe. Information is a product, and we consume it. So I want to ask a question about this revolution and walk through it with you, just as a way of maybe shaking up some of your gray cells before you head off into class. If there's a revolution going on, what sort of revolution is it? It could be a revolution in the techniques employed by technology suppliers to shape our purchase decision-making behavior. The revolution will be televised, webified, jammed into our inboxes, assaulting us at every turn. It could be that sort of revolution. It's not like we don't have those from time to time. It could be a revolution in data, in the data that's actually being consumed by commercial decision makers as raw material for their decision-making process. It could be a revolution in methods and practices. We could be making decisions in fundamentally different ways than we have in the past. And certainly, those people who are sailing under the flag marked analytics want us to believe that it's actually the nature of decision-making that's changed. And it could be a revolution in technologies, the technologies that are deployed to support the decision-making process. Now, I promised Paul Kautza that I would get through a 45-minute presentation without saying the H word, and indeed I'm going to. But it's very difficult these days to talk about decision support without drifting into a technology discussion. And all of us who think about ourselves as being people who build systems that support commercial decisions ought to be troubled by that fact. Decisions predate technology and will be here long after the last supply of electrons is turned off. So let's look at A, that this is a revolution in the techniques employed by suppliers. On the screen, I have a nice piece of spam that arrived in my inbox literally while I was preparing this presentation. This is ripped from the headlines. You can't read it, and I don't want you to because you don't need to read it, do you? We all know what it says. There are 3 things, 7 things, 9 things, 5 things that you need to know about big data. Let me give you a little taste. Here's a little taste. Bullet, 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 bullet. Press the button. Everybody can see where the button is, right? It's big and it's red. That is what is called in the science of marketing the call to action. And marketing has become a science. Anybody here build marketing support systems for marketing decision makers? All right, this is the click-through. The call to action promotes the click-through. The click-through leads to the form fill. The form fill produces a marketing qualified lead. This is what we are. We are marketing qualified leads clicking on the big red button. This is a Skinner box. Anybody seen one before? It was developed in the late 1960s by B.F. Skinner, the father of behavioral psychology, who proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that rats, and by extension human beings, could be trained by a simple system of rewards and punishments to produce the same behavior over and over again. Turn on the yellow light. If the rat presses the right bar, he gets some Purina rat chow. If he presses the wrong bar, he gets an electric shock. Over time, he was able to demonstrate that he could produce cadres of rats who would diligently press the right bar, the call to action, and get the reward every single time. There is no doubt that part of the revolution we're living through is a marketing revolution. It isn't simply that what used to be done in a haphazard manner, demand creation, is now done in an extraordinarily carefully instrumented, tested scientific way. All of that is true. But we are bombarded by messaging which is increasingly look-alike, are we not? On the previous slide, I erased the particular vendor to protect the innocent, or the guilty as the case may be, but it could have been any vendor. We hear the same messages again and again and again from every single supplier in the marketplace, and repetition produces reality. There must be a revolution because everybody says so. We can't underestimate the extent to which this particular part of this kind of extended metaphoric landscape that we're looking at is one that's engineered to produce a particular kind of response in us. The sense that we are missing something, that we are falling behind, that we are not doing things properly. Might be true, might just be marketing. Could it be that we're having a revolution in the data that's consumed by decision makers? For sure. For sure that is happening. Here is another piece of the revolution. This is an infographic. Anybody want to confess to having committed an infographic recently? Good, yeah. The idea here being that people want pretty, right? Now, I came up in a world that was ruled by a man named Edward Tufte who said, when you are dealing with information, every pixel on the screen that doesn't convey data is a lie. All right, anybody read the visual display of quantitative information? A couple people? This was a Bible in the early 90s for how you built human interfaces. We appear to have burned it and have moved to exactly the opposite model, which is as little information as possible and as many pixels that are pretty but convey no information. Nevertheless, you look at infographics like this, and what it tells you is that the kind of information that data warehouses and data marts and business intelligence were designed to manage are now one type of data, 92% in this infographic, in a very large portfolio of data types that a decade ago were not available. Now, I look at that, and I see all kinds of interesting things. I see social media data. Now, 5 years ago, this was the flag the revolution flew under. It was all about how all of us were going to be leveraging data from Twitter and Facebook and what have you to somehow radically transform our metal-bending, machine-driven B2B business models. Didn't actually happen, but it's still quite relevant for a lot of companies. You see RFID data up there. The assertion that people are making use of data from astronomy in order to make commercial decisions. And I'm sure that's true somewhere. What I see that's interesting in this model is that most of this data is coming from the edge of the organization. And I don't think you can underestimate this aspect of the revolution. When I got into the biz in the early 90s, the job was really straightforward. There was a lot of important decision-making data, and it was locked up in a relatively small number of systems at the center of the organization. ERP systems, other transactional applications. The business's IT infrastructure was a roach motel. Data went in, but you couldn't get it out. And we built infrastructure to get the data that was in the center of the organization out and into the hands of decision makers. It was all about the center. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Yes? No? That's not where the action is anymore. The action, apparently, is now out on the edge. And gee, if you think about a lake, that's true, isn't it? Things start at the edge of the lake, and they return to the edge of the lake. People go swimming. We stand on the beach, we look at the water, we dive in, we swim around. Nothing human lives in the lake. Now, there are fish and other sorts of things. I've never figured out in the metaphor of the data lake what the analog of the fish is, but I think it's an interesting question to consider. What we're seeing in this revolution is the construction of new systems that start at the edge, go into the data lake, and end up on the edge. When I look at people who are employing big data volumes at big data velocities using big data technology, most of them are building systems that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. They call them customer interaction systems or supplier interaction systems, and they're drawing data out of the lake in order to improve the specificity of an experience that some third party is going to have with their company at the edge of that company's sphere. Not in the center, but at the edge. These are classes of decisions that either weren't made at all 10 years ago or were made using the tried and true data-free method, one's gut, right? The biological algorithm. New systems, new decisions, new objectives, all putting pressure on the organization. If the revolution is real, this is one dimension in which it is assuredly real. Things start at the edge, move into the center, come back to the edge. This is not our traditional notion of how to support commercial decision making. This is a new way of thinking about it. When I talk to these people who are building these customer interaction systems, and I look and say, well, surely there's a data warehouse in there. Oh yeah, it's over there on the side. This data that we're capturing at the edge, we expect it to filter over there eventually and become part of the horizontal information distribution infrastructure. But that's not why we're building this system. We're not building it to feed the warehouse. We're building it to produce a better customer experience, to produce a better supplier experience, to more tightly integrate our partners or the end customer in our way of doing business, to raise their switching costs. It's all about decision making, but it's not about query reporting and dashboarding. Could be a revolution in our methods and practices. As my friend and colleague Mark Madsen, who I often do these kinds of things with, likes to say, we're living in a world now where everything has changed except us. And there's some truth to that. Our methods and practices are clearly changing. When I talk to technology folks, IT people inside of organizations that have bought the big data revolution, I hear phrases like data utility. Anyone heard this one? This is a really interesting idea. The notion here is that fundamentally, the IT organization has failed to support decision-making in the organization. What it has done a good job at is collecting and managing data. The data lake is a beautiful metaphor for these people. Oh, I see what we do now. We make lakes. We're not responsible for the swimmers, for the decision makers. They swim at their own risks. We're a data utility. We're going to pour all the data in one place. We're going to hand some of these beautiful next generation big data analytical tools to decision makers, all of whom are data scientists. And they're going to dive in the lake and swim. We just make sure the lake's full of water. So I had this conversation with a CIO at a very large oil and gas company just the other week. And he was very articulate. He said, this is how we are going to succeed. Our product is clearly understood. The service level agreement is clean. This is how we're going to make forward progress. This is how we're going to restore political credibility to the IT organization. So I said to him, okay, I think I understand this concept. What you're really saying is, you are going to become a data storage supplier to the business. He said, yeah, well, it's a little more complicated than that. But yes, we're going to store and make available data. And I said, okay, what's your long-term plan for competing with Amazon? That's the business Amazon's in. They've already taken the cost of storage on a per gigabyte basis down to the floor. No cloud service provider can compete with them. If IT defines the boundary of its value add as the building of the lake, we make a lake. It invites itself to be compared with every other potential supplier of lakes. And they're out there. Amazon, Microsoft, Google. Bigger scale, better technologists. Scary idea, the data utility. And it's bound up with that second notion, the notion of self-service. In the old metaphoric world, in the world of data warehouses and marts, what we did was we produced finished goods. Here is your information product. It is resident in this schema, in this mart, and here is the tool that you use to access it. Our product was that data organized in that way and presented through those tools to that constituency. It was a challenge making finished goods for our users. The goods were never quite right, were they? They never showed up in time. They were constantly being taken off the shelf and modified. It was a problem. It was worse in the warehouse. In the mart, at least, you were dealing with one or two constituencies and a half dozen products. But by the time you got back to an actual enterprise data warehouse, which purported to represent all of the information products that were the business, it was an extraordinary challenge to be in this kind of information manufacturing business. And a lot of us did not succeed in doing that. And so self-service rose up. Oh, you don't need a finished product. All you need is access to the raw data and a good tool, and you can assemble it yourself. DIY, kind of the Home Depot of commercial decision making. Has anyone gotten this pitch? There are many vendors out there who are selling products that are explicitly designed for self-service. Yes? No? Surely you've heard this. This is part and parcel of the data lake metaphor. If you have a lake full of water, how are you going to extract information from that? Well, you're going to use a self-service tool. Here it is. It isn't just about making data pretty. It's about plucking this information from here and this from here and that from there and putting it together into a kind of a build-it-yourself rectangle of information that will answer your need. And the good news is when you're done with it, you can throw it away. Sound familiar? Works really, really well from a metaphoric perspective if you've already kind of bought off on the notion that your job is to be a data utility. And then there's the third problem, or the third challenge. We used to think of ourselves as being in a manufacturing and logistics business. We take data from these sources, we run it through a very elaborate but well understood manufacturing process, and we produce a defined output in the target schema, in the warehouse, or the mart. And we can describe exactly how we got from our sources through the manufacturing process, which we called ETL or ELT or data engineering, to the finished product. It's documented. It's well managed. We treat it like a software project. We version it, et cetera, et cetera. It is a world-class manufacturing process. In the lake, that's not how we do things. We do what's being called continuous data integration. Data is always pouring into the lake, and hundreds or perhaps thousands of quasi-autonomous decision makers with self-service tools are engineering what they need, when they need it, and then in many cases, when they're done, throwing it away. Now, this is a very different model than the model we've come from. It's actually more complex. For any one individual, it might be a simple matter of identifying a few files in a very large distributed file system which shall remain unnamed, according to a method which is not inherent in that distributed file system. I have to know where those files are. I have to know what's in them. I have to know how they're formatted. I have to know where they came from. I have to know what the significance of the data is within them and what those data elements are good for and what they're maybe not good for. But of course, I know all that because I'm a data scientist. And then I use my self-service tool, and I engineer that data into the rectangle that I need to make a particular business decision, and then I throw it away. And maybe the engineering that I did to produce that rectangle survives, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe it, like the rectangle, vanishes. That's what continuous data integration is when you look at it at the detail level. And that kind of brings us to technologies. Does anybody recognize this graphic? Anybody? Raise your hand if you recognize this graphic, because this is kind of a litmus test. Okay, we got a couple dozen hands. So some of us got into this business because in the early 90s, we read this book by this guy named Bill Inman called Building the Data Warehouse. And in the book, Inman kind of scratched his head and he said, have you noticed that there appears to be a ton of data extraction going on in most organizations? The number of requests that I, Bill Inman, see in my customers for extracts from mainframes is going through the roof. And if you map out these extracts, what you see is that the extract is being used by a bunch of people as a data source. And they're taking yet further extractions from them, and they're adding data to it, and it's cascading. It's kind of a natural, what did he call it? Naturally evolving architecture. He said, but there's a problem with this. And unfortunately, Bill, I think, had not at that time been to Tufte's class. And he said, the problem is that in this naturally evolving architecture, if you allow extracts and extracts of extracts and extracts of extracts of extracts to dominate your decision-making process, you can have two organizations, Department A and Department B, ask the same question in this environment, and they will get wildly different answers. And that's the minus 15 plus 10, which of course is overwhelmed by the rest of the diagram, and many people miss the fact that that's even there. He said, I think this is a problem. And all over first world economies, technologists nodded their head and said, yes, this is how things are being done now, and yes, it is a problem. And he said, I have an answer. And he deployed this very powerful metaphor, the data warehouse. The notion that if you control the randomness of this extraction of extraction of extraction, you might limit the number of occasions in which Department A and Department B get answers to questions that are off by 25 percentage points. The irony, I would assert, is that this picture is the picture that big data strives to produce. A world of continuous data integration and self-service decision-making performed on top of an infrastructure which is nothing more than a data lake run by a data utility. Everyone does their own extraction and processing. We have come full circle in what, 25 years? Not even 25 years. From asserting that this is a problem to be solved to asserting that this is a state we would like to actually engender in our own organizations. Food for thought. So what's the answer to the question? I think the answer to the question is, A, all of the above. Should be E, my apologies. I think PowerPoint helped me with my lettering there. All of these things are changing. As Madsen says, everything has changed except us. We all know that demand for data inside our organizations is rising, to use that water metaphor. And it's rising inexorably. This is actually a victory. Strange as it may seem, when I used to stand up in forums like this in the mid-1990s, one of my biggest challenges was convincing commercial decision makers that using data to make decisions was a good idea. It was viewed as a sign of a weakness, managerial weakness, to need data, because good managers just knew. Good decision makers just knew. In many cases, they knew better than their data. So the fact that demand for data is rising inexorably in most information economies inside most companies that I'm familiar with, I think is a victory. I think the first and fundamental victory of the industry has been achieved. People now believe that they need data to make decisions every day in all sorts of ways. We ought to reward ourselves and our colleagues for having achieved that. And the supply is now rising. We can get more information about just about everything from somewhere. It's of some quality. We don't quite know how high quality it is, but we can always get data. So in our information economy, we got rising demand, we got rising supply. One of our problems is, of course, that everybody thinks they're a plumber. Those people who represent that rising demand are not going to sit around and wait for us to run the pipes to get the data from where it is to where they want it to be. They'll do it themselves. This is the shadow IT problem. Anybody struggling with this now? It is rampant. It is everywhere. Everybody's a plumber. Now, exactly how a lake solves that problem, I'm not entirely sure. But one of the assertions of the proponents of data lakes and of this data utility notion coupled with self-service to produce continuous data integration in the lake, one of their assertions is that this model will do a better job of balancing supply and demand and a better job of keeping IT in a viable position than the precursor metaphor, than warehouses or marts have done. And it's certainly true that the way in which we have built warehouses and marts has tended as often to stifle demand as it has to supply it. So, rising demand, rising supply, everybody's a plumber, so if we don't plumb it, our end users will. But another thing that's changed is I think the era of leverage from finished data goods has pretty much drawn to a close. There was a time when if your organization had successfully deployed a working business intelligence infrastructure, you competed at an advantage relative to other companies in your markets who had not yet done that. There was leverage from doing that. But that leverage has declined over the last 5 years, and that era is drawing to a close, and that is now considered part of the price-to-play infrastructure that every competent IT organization has to produce. Leverage is coming from somewhere else. Leverage is coming from analytics. Has anybody heard this story? Analytics, whatever they are different than business intelligence. Business intelligence is price to play. You have to put email in your organization, you need a financial ERP system, you need telephones, you need BI, infrastructure, price to play. The leverage comes from analytics. If analytics means computationally intensive, algorithmically and heuristically processed data that either projects or prescribes or predicts, then the idea that leverage comes from analytics is probably right. Unfortunately, analytics as often means pretty as it does powerful. And I'm not sure that pretty gives you much leverage unless you believe that there are a lot of value in infographics. Continuous distributed data integration becomes the norm. If you embrace big data technologies as they exist in the market today, you are embracing this notion. They are coupled together like this. 100% of the big data technologies we have available to us are built on the notion that data integration is a continuous process from here on out. Not manufacturing, not moving from point A to point B, staging for consumption, but continuously integrated. And then there's that problem. We are in the business of supporting commercial decisions. Decisions made by people in positions of responsibility in companies, many of which are publicly traded, have shareholders, produce products and services which, if not used in the proper way, can harm other people and organizations. We work in companies that are regulated by locales and cities and states and the federal government, and increasingly by other international players. Commercial decisions, unlike decisions that are made in academia or decisions that are made in our personal lives, have governance, regulatory, and compliance implications, GRC implications. Our decisions are not free, and the long-term effects of them sometimes come home to roost in very unpleasant ways. Who here has been, as part of their job in data warehousing or BI, on the receiving end of a legal hold order? A few. Fun? Horrifying, wasn't it? We have no provisions for how one does legal hold when the legal hold implicates the data warehouse. It never occurred to us that that might happen. Suddenly, there are tens or hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, and we don't know how to do this. We didn't think about it until the bad thing happened. There's the tension at the heart of the metaphor of the data lake. Continuous distributed data integration in this giant lake of data is going to become the norm. We're not going to be manufacturing finished goods anymore. We're going to be managing the natural resource that is data. Data is like water. But commercial decisions are still of GRC import. The federal government opposing counsel does not care that we've embraced the data lake and the idea of continuous data integration. We still have to deal as data managers, as decision support systems people, with the fact that the decisions we support have governance, regulatory, and compliance implications in almost all cases these days, particularly in the United States. If we don't figure out how to bring continuous data, distributed data integration, and GRC requirements together, two things are true. Thing one, we will not be doing our jobs as data managers. And thing two is, we're going to have a fire. And it's likely to be big, and it's likely to be ugly. And it's likely that not until we have the first of these fires will the supply side of the market stand up and say, for example, gee, I guess we need good metadata management tools for the data lake. Here's the litmus test for all of you who are considering diving into the lake. How are you going to manage all of the metadata that you have taken for granted for the last 5, 10, 15, or 20 years of your career in this brave new world? In the old world, we knew exactly where things came from, exactly how they were transformed, exactly where they were, how long they had been there. Signposting end users was easy. You want to ask that question, go to that location. In a lake, it's just water. Did it come from the pristine spring at the headwaters of the Cuyahoga River Valley? Or did it come out of the stinking, ugly pipe at the chemical factory? Don't know, just water. It's in there. The metaphor is going to shape our thinking. If you go today, you can swim in the Cuyahoga. People boat in it every day. It took 50 years to clean it up. And untold billions of dollars. I don't think it was declared a Superfund cleanup site, but it was close. And it was certainly as complex as some of the Superfund sites, if anybody's ever been involved in that kind of complexity. The metaphor is a metaphor about natural resources. The data is now a natural resource, that it will be used in many different ways, and that if you want it to stay clean, it has to be managed systematically. So I'll just close by observing that any of you who are sitting in this room thinking that this revolution has made your job easier, it hasn't. It's made all of our jobs more complicated. Thanks, that's my shtick. Have a good day.